I want to look at two passages with you today that it would have never occurred to me to connect together until this summer when I heard my friend Lawrence Kelly preach. And he really didn't make a big point of this. He actually just made a very quick passing reference at some comparisons that could be made between two passages found in the Gospel of Mark. And I've thought about it a lot ever since I heard his drive-by point. So I want to think about it with you today. And the first passage is found in Mark in chapter 5, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. And I'm just going to read the first few verses here to get us started today. Mark chapter 5. Verse 1 says this: They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. Now, if there is one point Mark wants us to get about the status of this man, it is that this man is unclean. A point Mark makes in several ways. First of all, he says in verse 1 that he lived in the country of the Gerasenes on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. That's Gentile territory. So number one, this man is an unclean Gentile. In the second place, Mark tells us in verse 2 that he has an unclean spirit. And in fact, we're going to see an enormous number of unclean spirits. And in the third place, you notice that in verse 3 it says he lived among the tombs, which of course would be a place that is unclean because it is the place where there are corpses, where there are dead bodies. In fact, that point is reiterated in verse 5 when it says he was night and day among the tombs. This enables us to anticipate what's going to happen in this story, because already in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has shown his power to transform those who are unclean into a status of cleanness. Going all the way back to the very first chapter, one of the first miracles recorded in the Gospel of Mark is described in chapter 1 and verse 40 when a leper came to Jesus, who of course by virtue of his skin condition is considered unclean. And he begs Jesus, "If you will, you can make me clean." And moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him. Now, under normal circumstances, when a person touched someone who was unclean, what happened? The uncleanness transferred to them. But not in this instance. He stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. And if you go back to Mark 5, the next couple of stories in the chapter also illustrate this same power of Jesus to transform the unclean to the clean. Remember, there's two stories wrapped up into one. There is on the one hand the story of a man whose daughter is gravely ill at the point of death. In fact, she ends up dying. And embedded within that story is the story of the woman who for 12 years had a bleeding disease in a constant state of hemorrhaging. And of course, both of those conditions also made someone unclean under the law. And yet, as you know, Jesus takes care of both of them. So knowing that Mark wants us to see the power of Jesus to transform the unclean to the clean, let's go back to this story and start reading again at verse 6. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." This man doesn't just have an unclean spirit, he has unclean spirits. In fact, Legion is the name of the detachment of Roman soldiers, which at full strength is approximately 6,000 soldiers. This man has thousands of demons, an entire army of legions. And yet, this army of demons is terrified of one man. Terrified of Jesus. Begs Jesus not to torment them. Verse 10, and he begged them earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now, a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, send us to the pigs, let us enter them. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Now, I recognize that offends certain modern sensibilities, and quite frankly, it sort of offends me. I mean, I just envision a lot of bacon and pork chops and ribs that are going to waste here. And the fact that these demons hurled the pigs into the water shows us just how destructive and deadly these demons actually could be. It is their inherent nature to be destructive. In the context of this story, though, there is no better place for unclean spirits to be sent than into the animals that epitomized animals that were unclean. And the fact that as soon as these demons go into the pigs, they immediately send the pigs to their deaths is not a mystery in light of the fact of what they had been doing to a human being. Remember what they had done to him. He had been living in tombs. He had been gashing himself with stones. This sight of hundreds of swine stampeding to their deaths must have been unsettling. Verse 14 says, the herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. By the way, this tells us another effect of the demons. They had stripped this man, but now he's clothed and in his right mind. But it's the reaction of the people that I especially want you to notice. Do you see what it says at the end of verse 15? And they were afraid. Not rejoicing, not celebrating that the local demonized man has finally been set free. In fact, verse 16 says, those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. These people were more at home with a man with an army of demons than with Jesus. But this is not the first time that a mighty work of Jesus has elicited this kind of reaction. The previous story in the Gospel of Mark, in Mark chapter 4, describes the great windstorm while Jesus and the disciples are out on the sea, and they beg Jesus to save them. And in verse 39, he rebukes the wind and says, peace, be still. And it says in verse 41, they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And it isn't the last time there's a reaction like this. If you go over to chapter 6, in verse 45 and following, it describes for us the story of Jesus walking on the water. And you remember that when the disciples see him coming, in verse 49, they cry out. Verse 50 says, they saw him and they were terrified. And Jesus has to say to them, do not be afraid. But they were fearful. Why? Well, here's the reason. Jesus shows a pattern of doing things that everybody knows is impossible for a human being to do. And that is unnerving to the people who see it. Have you ever seen these videos of like street performers who are made up to appear as if they're statues. I mean, and they're absolutely still. And somebody walks along and suddenly they start to move. What is the reaction of every person when they see that happen? Is the reaction, oh, well, this is great. Statues can come to life. No, it's terror. It is fear. That isn't supposed to be able to take place. It's horrifying to see something that you think is impossible happen right in front of you. We have had many funerals here at this building. Some of them have had open caskets. If in the middle of a service, the corpse suddenly sat up, turned to us, and smiled, nobody in here is going to go, oh, how wonderful, my beloved so-and-so is now alive. We would scream, jump up, and there would be bedlam as we all ran out of this room. Even when it's something that you would think on paper, we would say, oh, that's wonderful. But when it is nothing you could ever expect could happen, and you see it, and you realize there is awful, and I mean that in the literal, full of awe, awful power at work and on display, it will strike fear in your heart. Because that kind of power is frightening. Now, I mentioned we're going to look at two passages. Hold your place here in Mark chapter 5, and go with me to the other passage, which is in Mark chapter 16. Mark 16. Now, by this time, Jesus, of course, has already been tried. He's already been sentenced. He's already been executed by crucifixion. And in that experience, he has gone through a lot of things that the man in Mark 5 we just read about has experienced. The man in Mark 5 had been stripped naked. Jesus was stripped. Not by demons, but by greedy soldiers who looked at his clothing as spoils of victory to plunder. Like the man in Mark chapter 5, Jesus has been gashed with wounds. Like the man in Mark 5, Jesus has been treated as an outcast. And like that man has come to a tomb. But of course, there is a striking difference. Jesus was not overpowered by the forces of evil. Remember, he's the man who can destroy a legion of demons with a word. He is the one who could have called down 12 legions of angels from heaven. Now, he suffered these things willingly. And what Jesus willingly suffered, he suffered because he came to do for us what he came to do for the leper, what he came to do for the demon-possessed man, what he came to do for the woman with the bleeding disease, what he came to do for Jairus' daughter, to make the unclean clean. So let's pick up the story here in Mark 16 and verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This used to puzzle me, that they were afraid. until someone pointed out all of those other accounts where Jesus did something that no man can do. And just like the calming of the storm, and just like the driving out of thousands of demons, and just like walking on water demonstrated Jesus' awful, awesome, amazing power, we have just read the most amazing exhibition of the power of Christ. And Mark was careful to point out, if you go back to chapter 15 and verse 40, that these women had been with Jesus during this entire process. They saw all of his suffering. They saw the gashing of the wounds. They saw him heaving to breathe. They saw him finally give up the ghost. In verse 47 of chapter 15, it says they saw where he was buried. And so no wonder these ladies who have seen all of this suffering, who've seen Jesus be placed in the tomb, now in the presence of unprecedented power, were terrified. That's why the angel said in verse 6, don't be alarmed. And indeed, they will regain their composure and continue to follow Jesus. They will continue to follow the one who has fearful power. And as we have gathered today to remember Jesus' death and resurrection, it's good for us to reflect on the sheer power that was demonstrated in what Jesus did. We are commemorating his atonement for our sins and also his conquest of death. He is the first human being ever who died and was raised and transformed never to die again. And maybe fear and terror are not exactly the right words to describe the sense of emotion that we have when we come to the table today. We feel faith and we feel gratitude. But we should remember that we also are followers of fearful power, awesome power, awful power, power, though, that seeks to save us, to restore us, to cleanse us, to defeat the forces of evil that shackle us and give us new and eternal life. We are followers of a fearful power that has been wielded for our benefit. Just like the guy in Mark chapter 5. And I ask you to hold your place there so we could go back and see how his story ends. Mark 5, verse 18. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, 10 Greek cities, how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Today, as we commemorate the Lord's death and resurrection, Paul says that what we are doing is we are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. And so today we have the pleasure of doing what this man did, and that is proclaiming how much Jesus, the one with fearful, awesome power, we can proclaim how much that Jesus has done for us.